Hook. The first thing people noticed was the sound, a low mechanical thunder that had no business being this close to a civilian building. Three black military vehicles rolled into the parking lot of Hartwell Regional Medical Center as the last light bled out of the Colorado sky. Armed soldiers moved in tight formation through the sliding front doors like they'd rehearsed it. Staff froze in the hallways, patients gripped their bed rails. And at the far end of the lobby, a young nurse in pale blue scrubs was being escorted toward the exit by two security guards, fired, humiliated, finished. Nobody knew yet that the soldiers hadn't come to investigate. They'd come to find her. If this story grips you, follow along to the very end. Hit like, drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this one travels. Denton Falls was the kind of town that looked peaceful from a distance. Nestled at the foot of the Rockies, population 42,000, it had two traffic lights on Main Street, a farmer's market on Saturdays, and exactly one hospital serving the entire valley. Hartwell Regional Medical Center wasn't large by any standard. 6 floors, 214 beds, and a reputation that had been coasting on a good name for longer than it deserved. Nora Voss had been working there for 14 months. She'd applied for a position in the ICU. They'd placed her in general med-surg instead, citing a need for balanced staffing, which was administrator language she'd learned to translate pretty quickly. It meant, "We're not sure about you yet." She was 28, transfer paperwork that listed her prior employer only as U.S. Department of Defense, contract concluded, and a calm that some people found reassuring and others found unsettling. She didn't explain herself much. She showed up, did the work, and went home. Most days that was enough to stay invisible. Most days. The morning that everything changed started the way the worst days always do, quietly, with no warning at all. Nora arrived at 6:47 a.m., 13 minutes before her shift. She changed into her scrubs in the locker room, tied her dark hair back, and checked the board before the overnight team had finished their handoff notes. 3 discharges pending. 1 post-op from the night before running a low-grade fever. A 61-year-old man in room 412 who'd been asking for his daughter every 20 minutes since 2 in the morning and not getting any answer from the nursing station. She noted that one specifically. She stopped by 412 before anything else. The man's name was Gerald. He was recovering from a hip replacement, and the fever wasn't dangerous, but he was scared and alone, and nobody had taken the time to sit with him for more than 90 seconds. Nora pulled a chair to his bedside and explained in plain language what was happening in his body, why it was normal, and what the team would do about it. She answered the questions he was embarrassed to ask the doctors. She stayed 7 minutes longer than she'd intended. When she came back out, her charge nurse, a quick-tempered woman named Patrice Odom, who was under constant pressure from administration and passed it along faithfully, told her she was behind on her morning assessments. "I'm not behind," Nora said. "I'm on time." "You were supposed to start on the East Wing." Gerald hadn't been checked in 6 hours. He was febrile and anxious. That's a clinical priority. Patrice looked at her the way she always did, like Nora was one wrong sentence away from a formal complaint. "Just stick to the assignment order. It's not complicated." Nora didn't argue. She moved to the East Wing and completed her assessments in order efficiently without cutting corners. She documented everything in real time. Caught a medication discrepancy on a post-cardiac patient that had been missed on the overnight chart, flagged it to the attending, and had it corrected before morning rounds began. The attending, Dr. Whitmore, thanked her briefly in passing. Patrice didn't mention it. Gareth Slade arrived at Hartwell Regional every morning at precisely 8:15, and the building felt it. He was the hospital's executive director, 53 years old, silver-haired, built like a man who'd once been athletic and had since replaced the discipline with authority. He carried himself through the corridors like a property owner walking the grounds, pausing to straighten a chair, comment on a smudged window, or call out a staff member for something minor in front of whoever happened to be nearby. He was, by any honest measure, the most effective fear manager in the building. Whether that made him a good administrator was a separate question that nobody on staff felt safe asking out loud. He had opinions about Nora Voss. He'd formed them early, within her first 2 weeks, and nothing she'd done since had changed them. She was too quiet. She didn't defer to him the way he expected staff to defer. When he spoke in the hallways, other nurses would pause, make eye contact, sometimes smile or nod in that reflexive way people do around people with power. Nora would acknowledge him. She wasn't rude, but she didn't perform the small social rituals of deference that Slade had come to expect as his due. She'd look at him clearly, respond directly if he addressed her, and then return to whatever she'd been doing. It bothered him more than it should have. He'd made a comment once, in her second month, about her documentation style. Thais said it was too detailed, that it slowed the billing cycle. She'd looked at him steadily and said, "Thorough documentation protects patients and staff both. I'll keep doing it the way I'm doing it. Not aggressive, not defensive, just certain." He hadn't forgotten that. Over the months that followed, it became a quiet, low-grade campaign. Nothing that could be written up formally. Slade was too careful for that. But it showed up in small ways. The best continuing education slots went to other nurses. When there was an opening in the emergency department, the role she'd actually applied for, he gave it to someone with less experience who laughed at his jokes. Performance reviews that should have been excellent came back with vague criticism. Communication style could be more collaborative. Team integration ongoing. She read each one, signed where required, said nothing. What Gareth Slade didn't know, what almost nobody at Hartwell Regional knew, was that Nora Voss had spent 5 years as a special operations combat medic with the 75th Ranger Regiment before a classified deployment overseas had ended her military career through circumstances she was not at liberty to discuss. She had been promoted to staff sergeant. She had performed surgical interventions under fire in conditions that would have buckled most people in this building. She had pulled 2 soldiers out of a burning vehicle in a place that didn't officially exist. The paperwork she'd filed when applying at Hartwell Regional listed her military service simply as medical support, various forward operating bases. She didn't elaborate. She didn't need the recognition. She just needed the work. That restraint, that quietness, was what Slade had mistaken for weakness. The moment it broke open happened on a Tuesday, in the middle of a shift change, in front of approximately 30 staff members in the main corridor outside the nursing station. It started with a patient complaint. A family had filed a grievance the week prior alleging that their father, a post-surgical patient, had waited too long for pain management after his night call light had malfunctioned. The complaint landed, as complaints often did, on the desk of whoever administration needed to make an example of. The overnight team had documented the malfunction. The log clearly showed the call light failure had been reported at 11:40 p.m. and addressed by maintenance at 1:15 a.m., a gap that was a facilities problem, not a nursing problem. Nora had worked that night. She had physically walked the floor every 40 minutes regardless of call lights, which was above what protocol required. She had checked on the patient twice during the gap period. It was documented. None of that mattered to Gareth Slade. He appeared in the corridor at 2:30 in the afternoon, mid-shift, which was unusual. He was holding a printed copy of the complaint. Patrice was standing near the station. 3 other nurses were in the corridor. An orderly, 2 visiting medical students, and a physician's assistant named Decker rounded out the audience. "Voss?" Slade said. She was coming out of a patient room, chart in hand. She looked up. "Yes?" "I need to talk to you about this complaint." He didn't lower his voice. He didn't gesture toward a private space. He opened the printed sheet right there in the corridor. "A patient in your care reported being left without adequate pain management for over 2 hours. That complaint pertains to a call light malfunction during a night I worked," she said. "It's been reviewed. The log shows—" "I'm not asking about the log. I'm asking about your judgment." He was looking at her now the way he reserved for these moments. That particular combination of disappointment and authority that had made other nurses cry in hallways, that had caused 3 staff departures in the past year alone. "You were on the floor. You knew there was a patient in distress. You failed to act." "That's not accurate." She wasn't raising her voice. "I physically rounded on that patient at 11:55 and again at 12:50. It's in my documentation." "Documentation?" He said the word like it amused him. "You know what I've noticed about nurses who over-document? They're usually covering for something." He let that land, let the hallway absorb it. "The thing is, Voss, I've had concerns about you for some time. Performance, attitude, fit." He folded the paper. "This complaint tells me what I already suspected. You're not the right fit for this team." The corridor was very still. Someone behind Nora, she didn't turn to look, drew a slow breath. "If you have a performance concern," Nora said, "that should be a documented conversation in HR, not this." "I'm the director of this facility." His voice dropped into something quieter, which was somehow worse. "I don't need HR's permission to assess my own staff. Clear your locker. I'll have security walk you out." He turned and walked away before she could respond. The hallway stayed quiet for a beat that felt much longer than it was. Nora looked at the chart still in her hand. She set it carefully on the nursing station counter, aligned neatly with the edge. Patrice was looking somewhere that was not at Nora. The medical students were studying the floor. Decker, the PA, met her eyes for 1 second and then looked away. She walked to the locker room. It took her 4 minutes to clear the locker. She'd never been the type to accumulate things at work. No photos, no personal mugs, no drawer full of small comforts. A spare set of compression socks. A protein bar she hadn't gotten around to eating. A dog-eared copy of a pharmacology reference guide she'd bought herself 2 years ago and annotated in the margins. She put everything in a canvas tote and zipped it. She didn't cry. She wasn't angry, exactly. Anger would have implied that this surprised her. She'd seen it building for months, had mapped the logic of it with the same methodical attention she gave to anything else. The pattern of small exclusions. The reviews that were never quite fair. The way Slade looked at her like she was a mild inconvenience he hadn't yet resolved. She'd known it would come to something. She'd stayed anyway, because the patients here needed nurses who knew what they were doing, and leaving on principle while Gerald still had a fever and Mrs. Alcantara down in 318 was 3 days post-op, and still being undertreated for breakthrough pain. That wasn't something she could square with herself. But now she'd been removed. So that was that. 2 security guards were waiting outside the locker room. They were polite. She'd worked alongside both of them long enough to recognize the discomfort on their faces. They weren't enjoying this. "It's fine," she told them. "I know the way out." They walked beside her anyway, down the corridor, past the nursing station where the shift had resumed and nobody quite looked up, through the main lobby where a man at the reception desk was spelling his name for the 3rd time to someone who wasn't listening, and toward the sliding glass doors that opened onto the afternoon. The sun was lower than she expected. She'd lost track of the hour inside. She pushed through the doors and the cold air hit her. The specific clean cold of Colorado at 4 in the afternoon in late October, the kind that carries pine and thin altitude. She stood on the sidewalk outside the main entrance with her canvas tote over one shoulder and let the air settle around her. The security guards went back inside. She stood there a moment, not moving, running through her mental checklist the way she always did after anything significant. A habit from the military. Debrief, even when no one's there to debrief with. What had just happened? What the next 48 hours would require? Whether any of it had been preventable, and whether it mattered now if it had been. She was going to need to contact HR formally, probably consult an employment attorney, though that felt premature. Her rent was 3 weeks from due. Her savings could cover 2 months if she was careful. The nursing license board complaint she'd need to file against Slade's conduct. She was already framing the language in her head. She was still building that list when the sound reached her. It came from inside the building first, a low electronic tone that she knew immediately, not from civilian training, but from something older and more embedded in her nervous system. A mass casualty alert, the kind that didn't drill. Through the glass doors, she could see the lobby change in real time. The reception desk clerk stood up. 2 nurses who'd been crossing toward the elevator broke into a run. A call came over the intercom. 3 short tones, then a calm, automated voice that couldn't quite mask the weight of what it was saying. Code Orange. All available trauma personnel report to emergency. This is not a drill. Code Orange. Nora turned toward the parking lot. The first ambulance came screaming in from the highway, lights strobing across the pavement. Behind it, a second. Then a third, followed by a fire department rescue unit and 2 state police cruisers. They came in fast and close together. The kind of convoy that meant volume, not one emergency but many, all arriving at once. She could hear faintly through the closed ambulance bay doors, the first voices starting to layer over each other. Paramedics calling out vitals, someone shouting for a gurney, a physician's voice cracking at the edges trying to maintain authority, over a situation that was already larger than the team could absorb. She was still on the sidewalk. She had a canvas tote on her shoulder, her nursing license in her wallet, and 14 months of Hartwell Regional under her belt. She had no job here anymore. She had no standing, no authorization, no clinical role. She also had 5 years of combat trauma medicine that had never once let a rescuable person die for lack of someone willing to act. Her hand was on the door before she'd consciously decided anything. Inside, it was already chaos, but the particular kind of chaos that had a shape to it if you knew how to look. Not random, not hopeless, just overwhelmed and fast-moving toward the second kind. The ER intake had 4 gurneys jammed into a space designed for 2. A paramedic was still delivering a handoff to a nurse who was clearly processing too many things at once. 63-year-old male, blunt thoracic trauma, GCS 8 on scene, BP was 80 palp in the rig, lost 2 large-bore IVs on the way in. The nurse, Nora recognized her as a second-year named Becca, was writing on her palm because she'd run out of room on the paper. A physician, Dr. Harlan Cruz, was at the central station trying to triage incoming information and failing to prioritize it fast enough. He was a competent internist who was now being asked to function as an emergency physician, which was a different skill set wearing the same coat. He kept redirecting his attention to the wrong things: administrative calls, a pharmacist asking about a protocol, a supply tech who needed a signature. Nora dropped the canvas tote behind the nurse's station without asking permission. She moved to Becca. "What's the board?" Becca blinked at her. "They fired you." "I know. What's the board?" A half second of recalibration, and then Becca pointed. 7 critical incoming, bus crash on Route 17, charter hit a bridge abutment. Another 4 ambulances behind these. We've got 1 functioning trauma bay and 1 surgeon in the building. Where's your second surgeon? Dr. Fasano is in a procedure, 40 minutes minimum. Anesthesia? 1 CRNA. Dr. Morales is driving in. Nora turned, took in the room in 3 seconds, and started moving. She went to the most critical gurney first. The 63-year-old, open airway compromised, SPO 2 dropping. She called to the respiratory tech. "Get me a BVM and prep for intubation. Straight blade, 7.5 tube, don't wait for the order. Get it ready and stand by." To Becca, "He needs a chest x-ray now, before anything else. If this is a tension pneumo building, we need to know in the next 4 minutes, not 10. "You're not authorized. Someone needs to be," Nora said. It wasn't sharp. It was just factual. "Tell me who's making the calls and I'll brief them. If it's no one, then we're talking." Becca looked at Dr. Cruz, who was still on the phone at the station. He looked at Nora. She could see him making the calculation, whether to be offended or whether to be relieved. And relief won, the way it does when the alternative is catastrophe. "Tell me what you need," he said. She told him. She moved through the room in a rhythm that she hadn't used since the last time she'd used it, which was in a forward operating base in a country that hadn't made the news that week. She sorted patients by what they needed in the next 2 minutes, the next 10, the next hour. She directed nurses by name and function, not title. She kept her voice level even when the noise in the room was peaking. She flagged a ruptured spleen on a woman they'd initially triaged as lower priority. The delayed presentation was the kind of thing that killed people quietly, and the nurse who'd assessed her hadn't had time to do a proper secondary. "She needs the OR now," Nora told Cruz, "before Fasano's done. Fasano can't..." "Then get Morales on the phone and have the room prepped so the second she walks through the door, we go." He made the call. In the doorway behind her, Patrice appeared, then stepped back. Gareth Slade arrived from the administrative corridor 2 minutes later. He stopped when he saw Nora. The expression that crossed his face moved through several stages: surprise, confusion, and then something that hardened into anger as his brain sorted out the implications. "What is she..." He started toward the station. "Someone tell me what she's doing in my ER." Nobody answered him. Not because they didn't hear him, because they were too busy, and Nora had just given Becca a task that required both hands and all of Becca's concentration, and Dr. Cruz was coordinating with the OR, and the next gurney was rolling through the bay doors with a paramedic running alongside, calling out numbers. Slade stood at the edge of the room and watched her work. She didn't look at him. The first hour was the hard one. The second one found a kind of terrible rhythm. Not smooth, not controlled, but survivable. Patients were being moved, stabilized, tracked. The two nurses who'd been closest to breaking at the 40-minute mark found their footing when they stopped trying to do everything and started doing one thing at a time, which was what Nora kept telling them. One patient, next task, come back. It was 6:12 in the evening when the windows shook. Not an explosion. She identified that immediately, in the fraction of a second before her body completed the threat response sequence it had been trained to start. Rotors. Multiple sets. Large airframes, military grade, low altitude. She didn't stop what she was doing. She finished the task. A wound packing she'd been guiding a younger nurse through, careful to keep the instruction clear and the hand steady. And then she looked toward the windows. Through the glass she could see the parking lot, and in the parking lot were things that had no business being in the parking lot of a civilian hospital in a valley town in Colorado. 3 vehicles. Black, armored, military plates. No civilian markings. And between the vehicles, personnel in tactical gear, moving with a direction and purpose that wasn't investigative. They weren't sweeping the area. They weren't establishing a perimeter. They were moving toward the building in a formation she recognized, toward a specific objective. Slade appeared at her shoulder. She could hear him behind her without turning around. "What is this?" he said, more to himself than anyone. "What is—" "Someone call the front desk. I need to know what—" The sliding doors opened. A man in military tactical dress entered the lobby first, cleared the space in one visual sweep the way people do when they've been trained to expect threats in rooms, and then moved aside. Behind him came 3 more personnel, and behind them, a figure in uniform. No tactical gear, just dress uniform, ribbons, and the kind of bearing that didn't belong to someone who was lost or confused or asking for directions. He was looking at someone. He was looking at the ER. He was looking at Nora. She had turned by then. She was standing in the middle of the trauma bay with blood on her gloves and someone else's crisis still unfolding 3 feet behind her. And the officer in the corridor raised his chin when he saw her face, and something in his expression changed. Not surprise, but confirmation. Slade stepped forward. "This is a restricted area. This hospital is in the middle of a mass casualty event, and you cannot just—" The officer walked past him. He stopped 4 feet from Nora. He looked at her directly, and there was a pause, a very brief one, where neither of them spoke, and the room was impossibly loud and impossibly still at the same time. Then he said in a voice that carried exactly far enough, "We need to talk, now." She didn't move right away. That was the thing people would remember later. Not the uniform, not the vehicles in the parking lot, not even the way the officer had walked past Gareth Slade like the man was furniture. What they remembered was that Nora Voss didn't flinch, didn't drop what she was doing, didn't turn toward the officer the way everyone else in the room had turned toward him. She finished writing what she was writing on the patient's intake card, set the pen down on the corner of the tray table with the same deliberate care she used for everything, and then she peeled off one glove and then the other, folded them inside out, and dropped them in the biohazard bin beside her. Then she looked at him. "I have patience," she said. It wasn't defiant. It was just the truth, stated in the same tone she'd used to tell Becca about the chest x-ray and to tell Cruz about the OR. The officer, his name tape read Aldrich, and the rank on his collar was Lieutenant Colonel, absorbed this without visible reaction. "I'm aware," he said. "This won't take long. Make it fast." He did. He pulled her into the short corridor outside the trauma bay, the one that connected to the family consultation room, and he kept his voice down because there were staff in earshot, and he was, whatever else he was, professionally careful. He told her, "There was a man in one of those vehicles who had been transported here because Hartwell Regional was the closest facility with an operating room. He was a federal asset. He had taken a penetrating injury to the upper chest during what Aldrich described, carefully, as an incident 2 hours north of here. He was alive. He was not stable. He had been through 2 field medics already, and the injury was complex enough that neither of them had been able to resolve it." Nora waited for him to finish. "What kind of penetrating injury?" she said. High velocity, entry subclavicular, trajectories unclear. He's got a hemothorax on the right, possible cardiac tamponade developing. His pressure's been soft for 40 minutes. He needs a surgeon. The surgeon here is occupied. Then you need to transport him to Denver. We can't transport him. He's too unstable and the flight time is 40 minutes minimum, she said. I know. I've done the math. She was already moving back toward the trauma bay. When did he last have a BP reading? 7 minutes ago, 82 over 50. And your field medics, what's their training level? 18 Delta, both of them. Special Forces medical sergeants. She didn't show any reaction to that. What have they tried? He listed it. Needle decompression, chest tube on the right side, 2 large bore lines, fluid resuscitation with a cautious hand because of the tamponade concern. All of it correct. All of it not enough. She stood in the corridor for a moment. Bring him inside, she said. Trauma Bay 2, it's clearing now. And find out exactly how much longer Fasano needs in the OR. Because the woman I sent up 10 minutes ago is the priority, and he cannot leave that room until she's closed. Understood. And Colonel, she said it without turning around, I need whatever equipment your medics brought. Field kit, all of it. Don't let them put it back in the vehicle. She walked back into the trauma bay. Well, the next thing Gareth Slade did was the thing that told everyone in that building exactly who he was. He followed her. Not into the consultation corridor. He hadn't been invited and some instinct had held him back, but he'd watched the exchange from the doorway, had seen the body language even if he hadn't caught the words. And when Nora came back through and started directing Becca and the remaining ER tech toward the second trauma bay, he crossed the room and planted himself between her and the supply cabinet. Stop, he said. She went around him. I said stop. You are not employed here. You do not have clinical privileges in this facility. Whatever that military person told you, it does not override hospital protocol. Get out of the trauma bay. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the supply cabinet, counting what was there, running inventory against what Aldrich had described. If you stand in this room, you're going to be in the way of patient care. Go stand somewhere else. This is my hospital. Then act like it. She turned to him then, briefly, just long enough to make it clear she was choosing to engage and could just as easily choose not to. A man is being brought in right now with a possible cardiac tamponade. That's blood in the pericardial sac. The pressure will collapse his heart within the next hour if it isn't relieved. Your surgeon is upstairs. Your second surgeon isn't here. Your ER physician is managing 7 other critical patients. She paused. I'm going to manage this one. You can call security, call the police, call whoever you want. Do it from out there. She turned back to the cabinet. Slade didn't move for a long moment. The room watched him without watching him. Everyone looking carefully at their own tasks, while tracking him in their peripheral vision. Becca was pretending to check a supply count. The ER tech, a young man named Tomas, who'd been at Hartwell Regional for less than a year, kept his eyes on the equipment cart. Slade turned and walked out. Not because he'd conceded anything. She could see it in the way he held his shoulders. He was going to make calls, going to find the exact administrative mechanism that would let him reassert control. She had maybe 20 minutes before he found it. 20 minutes was longer than she needed. Boom. The man they brought in was unconscious by the time the stretcher came through the bay doors, which was both easier and harder. Easier because a conscious, penetrating trauma patient with a tamponade developing was a patient who was afraid, and fear elevated heart rate. An elevated heart rate made every second count twice as fast. Harder because she couldn't get a verbal history, couldn't ask him where it hurt, or when the sensation had changed, couldn't use his own body's report to calibrate what she was seeing. She used everything else. The 2 field medics came in with him, both of them younger than she'd expected, early 30s, faces tight with the particular expression of people who'd done everything they were trained to do and knew it wasn't enough. One of them, who introduced himself only as Garrett, handed her the field notes without being asked. She read them while her other hand was checking the patient's jugular veins, distended, which confirmed the tamponade concern, and her eyes were running the full secondary assessment she'd already started building in her head. His name, she said. Garrett glanced at Aldrich, who had come in behind them. Reeves, Aldrich said. That's all you need. She absorbed that and moved on. Name was for documentation and for talking to him, and since he couldn't hear her using it, it was a lower priority. She called out to Becca. 12 lead if we can get it running. I need the echo machine. Does this department have a portable? Down the hall. It's old. Get it, and I need someone on the phone to the OR. I need to know if Fasano can come down for 15 minutes between closing and... No, never mind. He can't leave her open. She was already running a different path. Does Morales do procedures? What's her background? She's anesthesia, Becca said. Before that. Becca hesitated. I think she did a surgery residency. She switched. Find out. Right now. The portable echo came down in 4 minutes, which was actually fast for a machine that aged in a department this size. It was old enough that the image quality was the kind of thing that made radiologists wince, but image quality was a luxury, and she'd read worse. She positioned the probe herself, found the pericardial window, and looked. There it was. A dark rim of fluid around the heart, larger on the right side, the right ventricle visibly compressed with each beat. Not collapsed yet, but working against a resistance it couldn't sustain much longer. The heart was doing what hearts do, which was keep trying until the moment it couldn't, and the moment it couldn't was the moment she was racing to stay ahead of. He needs a pericardiocentesis, she said. It was directed at no one, and everyone simultaneously. The room needed to know the plan, needed to orient around it. I need a 16-gauge, a long needle, extension tubing, a syringe, and someone who can run the echo probe while I work. Who's done this before? Silence. Not looking for experience, looking for someone who can follow instructions exactly. Thomas raised his hand, which she hadn't expected from someone who'd been invisible for the last hour. Good, she said. Come here. I'll show you what you're watching for. She showed him. 30 seconds of instruction, precise and without condescension. What the probe needed to capture. What would change on screen when the needle was in the right position. What would tell her she was too deep or too lateral? He listened with the focused intensity of someone who understood the stakes, even if he didn't fully understand the anatomy. Don't guess, she told him. If you're not sure, say so. That's more useful than silence. Okay, he said. She believed him. But the procedure took 11 minutes. It was not clean. Clean was for procedure rooms with proper lighting and circulating nurses and equipment that had been calibrated in the last 6 months. This was a trauma bay in a valley hospital during a mass casualty event, with a portable echo that rendered everything in shades of gray that required interpretation, and a patient whose pressure had dropped to 78/44 by the time she was set up, and Tomas holding a probe for the first time in his career while Aldrich stood in the doorway watching, and Garrett, the field medic, stood on the other side of the gurney ready to call it if he saw something wrong. She talked through it as she worked, not for comfort, but for accountability. If she narrated, they could follow, and if they could follow, they could catch a mistake. It was something she'd learned in a different environment, with different stakes, and it transferred exactly. The needle went in at the subxiphoid angle. Tomas called the position. She advanced. The aspiration drew dark blood, not arterial, which was what she needed to confirm. She looked at Tomas. How's the heart? He was staring at the screen with his full body tensed, like he was trying to hold the image still through concentration. There's the fluid. I think it's less. The right side looks less squeezed. It wasn't technical. It was correct. She drew 60 milliliters and watched the pressure on the monitor. 86, 91. The waveform, which had been narrow and weak, began to broaden. Reeves was not out of trouble. He was less in it, which was a different thing and a meaningful one. She withdrew the needle slowly, maintaining pressure, watching the echo. Good, she said, and she was talking to Tomas specifically. Good job. He exhaled for what was probably the first time in 11 minutes. She straightened up. Her lower back registered a complaint about the angle she'd held for the last several minutes. She was 34 years old, not 22, and field medicine did things to a body. And she set the syringe down and stripped another pair of gloves. He needs the OR, she said to Aldrich. The tamponad's decompressed, but it'll reaccumulate. Whoever's doing the surgery needs to know there may be a pericardial tear or a vessel injury in the upper mediastinum. Tell them, I'll relay it. Tell them yourself or have me tell them. Don't paraphrase. It needs to be accurate. He looked at her for a moment. Then he took out his phone and handed it to her. She called up to the OR. Morales arrived at 7:43 p.m., still in her coat, keys in her hand. She was 51, small, with the clipped economy of movement that belonged to people who'd been solving emergencies for decades. She listened to Nora's handoff in the corridor outside the trauma bay with the kind of attention that didn't require clarification. She asked 2 questions, both specific, and when Nora answered them, she nodded and moved. "She'll take him up," Aldrich said from behind Nora. "I know. Fasano's closing now." "I heard." The main ER was still running. 6 of the original 7 critical patients had been stabilized, moved, or were holding. The 7th, an elderly man with a traumatic brain injury, had been transferred to the neuro-ICU at Nora's direction 30 minutes ago because Hartwell Regional did not have a neurosurgeon, and the window for intervention was closing in a way that required honesty about the facility's limits. She'd made that call over Crew's hesitation, and it had been the right call, and they both knew it. She was standing at the nursing station, updating documentation. She'd been updating it in real time when she could, in memory when she couldn't. When Gareth Slade came back, he wasn't alone this time. There was a man beside him in business attire, someone Nora had seen once or twice in the facility, a legal or compliance function she hadn't had cause to interact with. Behind them, 2 security guards. "Voss?" Slade's voice had recovered its register, the controlled authority he'd used in the corridor that afternoon. "You need to leave this building. I have grounds to have you removed under trespassing. She's operating under my authorization." Aldrich had materialized at Nora's shoulder, and the way he said it was quiet and flat, the way a statement is delivered when the speaker knows it ends the conversation. Slade looked at him. "You don't have the authority to extend clinical privileges in a civilian." "I'm not extending clinical privileges. I'm invoking federal emergency medical provisions under Title 10, Section 1094 of the U.S. Code, which allows qualified personnel to provide emergency care in civilian facilities during active federal operations. The gentleman currently in your OR is a federal asset. This situation qualifies." He paused. "Your legal counsel is welcome to review the statute." The man in business attire was already pulling out his phone. Slade stood very still for a moment. The expression on his face was the expression of a man whose tools had stopped working and who hadn't yet decided what to pick up next. "This isn't over," he said. "No," Aldrich agreed. "It isn't." He turned and walked away. Nora watched Slade process that and then turned back to the documentation she'd been updating. She hadn't stopped writing. By 9 o'clock, the acute phase of the mass casualty event had moved from chaos to exhausted management, which was a different kind of hard, the kind that settled into people's shoulders and slowed their speech, and made them forget what they'd eaten and when. The bus crash had sent 19 patients to Hartwell Regional in total. 3 had required surgical intervention. 2 were in the ICU. The rest were admitted to various floors, stable or trending that way. Nora was still in the department. Nobody had asked her to stay. Nobody had asked her to leave either. Slade had disappeared after the exchange with Aldrich, and the administrative machinery he'd been preparing to deploy had apparently stalled, at least for now. The nurses around her had simply continued to treat her as what she'd been acting like for the past 4 hours, which was the person who knew what to do next. Becca found her at 10 minutes past 9, reviewing a set of labs on a patient 2 bays over. "You should eat something," Becca said. "I'm fine. I've got half a sandwich in my locker. It's turkey." Nora looked up. Becca was 26 and had been a nurse for 3 years, and her eyes right now had the redness of someone who'd been too focused to cry and was now, in the relative quiet, becoming aware that crying was probably appropriate. "You did good tonight," Nora told her. "You kept telling me what to do." "You did it correctly. That's not nothing." Becca was quiet for a moment. "They really fired you this afternoon." "Yes." "For what?" "Gareth Slade had concerns about my fit." Becca made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "You saved 6 people tonight, maybe 7, if Reeves—" "Don't count on outcomes until they're outcomes." "Right." She paused. "Did you—" I mean, were you actually military? The way that Colonel talked to you? I was, Nora said. Nothing more than that. She handed the lab report back to Becca and moved on. Aldrich found her at 9:40 in the family consultation room she'd appropriated as a temporary workspace. He sat down across the table without being invited, which she noted and didn't comment on. Reeves is out of surgery, he said. Morales and Fasano both said the decompression bought him the window they needed. If you hadn't done it when you did, how is he? Stable. ICU for now. They think he'll make it. She nodded. I need to ask you something, he said. Go ahead. He looked at her for a moment, assembling his words with care. How long have you been here, at this hospital? 14 months. And before that, how long were you out of service? 8 months. He absorbed this. Did you choose to come here specifically? She held his gaze. What are you actually asking me, Colonel? I'm asking whether you're done, he said, with the kind of work you were trained for. The room was quiet enough that she could hear the corridor outside. A cartwheel, a distant announcement, someone's sneakers on the linoleum. She'd spent 8 months after her discharge trying to want the quiet, the civilian schedule, the regular hours, the problems that were big in the moment and resolved cleanly. She'd spent 14 months at Hartwell Regional telling herself this was what she'd chosen. I'm going to need to think about that, she said. He nodded. He seemed satisfied with that answer, which she found interesting. He stood up, straightened his jacket. There's something else, he said. Something you should know before tomorrow, because it will come out, and I'd rather you heard it now. She waited. Reeves wasn't just passing through this area, Aldrich said. He was here specifically. He's been part of a federal investigation that's been running for the better part of 2 years. Financial crimes, primarily, connected to healthcare systems in rural corridors. Billing fraud, compliance falsification, Medicare and Medicaid misrepresentation. He paused. The investigation has a target, Nora. It's been active for several months. The reason I'm telling you now is that the paperwork that comes with Reeves's presence here, the federal documentation that will enter the public record as a result of tonight, is going to make certain things visible that certain people would prefer remained invisible. She was very still. What target? She said, though she already had a partial answer forming. The facility, he said, and its director. The air in the room didn't change. Nothing moved. She sat across from him and processed what he'd said with the careful, methodical attention she gave to all information that mattered, because information that mattered deserved to be handled correctly. How long has Slade been under investigation? She said. Formally? 14 months. He held her gaze. You've been here 14 months. She said nothing. I need you to understand, he continued, that your presence here is documented. Your treatment by the administration here is documented. And the work you did tonight is documented. All of that is going to matter in the next 72 hours in ways that I'm not fully authorized to detail right now, but I wanted you to have a framework. You're telling me to be ready. I'm telling you that you've already been ready. Tonight made that clear to a lot of people. He said goodnight and left. She sat in the consultation room for a while after he was gone, not moving, letting the shape of the evening settle around her. Outside, the hospital continued its night rhythms, the muffled codes and announcements, the specific silence of corridors that have absorbed a crisis and are now metabolizing it. She thought about Gerald in room 412, wondered if anyone had checked on him tonight with everything else happening. She thought about the woman she'd sent to the OR, the ruptured spleen, whether she'd woken up yet. She thought about Tomas holding the echo probe with both hands and calling out positions like he'd been doing it for years. She wasn't thinking about Gareth Slade. She was thinking about the fact that for 14 months she had been careful. She had kept her head down, done her work, absorbed the small violences of his management without visible reaction because that was what the situation required, and she was trained to tolerate far worse. She had not once used what she knew, what she was, as leverage or defense or explanation. She had simply endured it and done good work anyway. And it had been seen, not by anyone at Hartwell Regional, by someone watching from somewhere else, building a case that had nothing to do with her and everything to do with what she'd been standing inside for over a year. She stood up. She had documentation to finish. The next morning arrived gray and cold, the kind of October morning that felt like the sky had not bothered to fully commit. Nora drove back to Hartwell Regional at 7 a.m., not because anyone had asked her to. She'd slept 4 hours on her couch, which was enough, but because the patients she'd treated the night before were still in that building, and the continuity of care mattered in a way that superseded whatever her employment status was. She expected to be stopped at the entrance. She wasn't. The security desk, staffed by a man named Roy who'd worked the morning shift for 11 years, looked up when she came in, looked at her, and said nothing. He went back to his newspaper. She walked through. The ER was in the quieter, slower phase of mourning, 3 occupied bays, a waiting room with 5 people who looked like they'd been there since last night, and one who was holding a cloth around his hand with the careful attention of someone who'd decided their cut was bad enough to come in, but wasn't sure they'd made the right call. She checked the board. The overnight notes were thorough. Whoever had been on had kept up. She found Becca's replacement, a day shift nurse named Hollis, who had the angular efficiency of someone who'd been on this team for years, and they did a quick verbal exchange on the most critical patients without any preamble about why Nora was there. Hollis simply treated her as someone who had information she needed, which was what she was. At 8:30, Dr. Cruz arrived. He stopped when he saw her, recalibrated, and then said, "You should know that Fasano told administration last night you were the reason Reeves survived." He put it in writing. That was between me and Morales and Fasano. He didn't need to do that. He disagreed. Cruz paused. Slade's not in yet. Nobody's seen him this morning. She noted this without comment. At 9:15, 2 men in suits arrived in the main lobby. They did not go to the reception desk. They walked directly to the administrative corridor with the ease of people who knew exactly where they were going, who had been to this building before in a different capacity. Roy watched them go. Hollis, from the nursing station, tracked them with her eyes. Nora, at the far end of the ER, did not look up. She'd been expecting this since last night. Aldrich had told her to be ready, and she was. What she hadn't expected, what she felt in the next moment with a clarity that caught her slightly off guard, was the sound of Gareth Slade's voice in the administrative corridor, raised in a way she'd never heard from him before. Not the controlled authority, not the measured disdain. Something that had given up the performance of calm entirely. "You cannot come in here without... This is a private facility. There are HIPAA implications. You need to..." A voice she didn't recognize. "Mr. Slade, we have a federal warrant. We need you to step aside." And then, very clearly, through 2 walls and a corridor and a lobby, silence. The kind of silence that comes after something falls. Hollis was staring at the corridor. Tomas, who was apparently also on the day shift, had stopped what he was doing and was doing nothing instead, which was not like him. Nora finished the note she was writing. She initialed it. She set the pen down. From the administrative corridor came the sound of a door opening and then footsteps. Not one pair, multiple, moving in a direction that she recognized as toward the main lobby, toward the front of the building, toward the exit. She didn't move to look. She knew what it meant. Aldrich had told her last night. The documentation around Reeves's transport would open things up, make certain records accessible under the federal investigation that had been running since before she'd arrived. 14 months of watching Slade operate. The billing irregularities she'd noticed and filed away, the compliance gaps she'd never been in a position to formally report, the patients she'd seen undertreated in ways that had never quite risen to the level of a reportable incident on their own, but assembled into a pattern she'd recognized long before she'd known there was a federal case being built around it. She'd reported none of it to administration. She'd been a nurse, not an investigator, but she'd documented it. Carefully, precisely, the way she documented everything. In her own records, kept on a personal drive she updated every 2 weeks. She had not been asked to surrender those records. Not yet. She thought it was probably only a matter of time. Mom. What she didn't know, what became clear only at 11 in the morning, when Aldrich appeared at the ER entrance and asked her to step into the consultation room again, was that the investigation had been in its final phase for 3 weeks, that Reeves had not been in the area by accident, That his injury, sustained in circumstances that were still classified, had altered the timeline in a way that had compressed everything, brought it forward, forced the federal team's hand before they'd planned to move. They would have waited another month, Aldrich said, built it out more. But Reeves is alive, and he's talking, and what he's telling the investigators from his hospital bed is going to make the extra month unnecessary. What does this have to do with me? She said. The investigators want to speak with you. She had been expecting that too. When? This afternoon, here, or wherever's convenient for you. Here is fine. She thought about it. I have documentation, records I kept on my own. I don't know if any of it is useful. Aldrich looked at her steadily. Where did you keep it? A personal drive. I updated it every couple of weeks. Specifics, dates, patient numbers redacted for privacy, observations about resource allocation, billing decisions I found irregular. I wasn't sure at the time if it rose to the level of a reportable issue. I kept it because I keep records of things I'm not sure about. He was quiet for a moment. Nora, that documentation may be exactly what closes this. She absorbed that. I'll retrieve it, she said. She stood up, and then she stopped, because something else had come to her. Something she should have placed earlier, but hadn't, because the last 18 hours had been moving too fast for any thought to complete itself fully. The investigation, she said. The target is Slade. And the facility. Yes. But the facility has a board of directors that approve the financial structures Slade was operating under. Some of them had to know. Aldrich's expression shifted. Not surprise, confirmation. How many members on the board, she said. 7 active. 3 are of significant interest to the investigators. She thought about the past 14 months, about performance reviews that came from above Slade, ratified by a board, about the continuing education slots and the way the ED position had been filled and the nursing staff turnover rate that anyone paying attention should have flagged 2 years ago. About the budget allocations she'd seen on documents she wasn't supposed to see but had, because she was thorough and thorough people noticed things. It goes higher than him, she said. Aldrich said nothing, which was an answer. She thought about Gerald in room 412 last night, alone and afraid. About the woman with the ruptured spleen who'd nearly been triaged into the wrong category. About every patient in this building who had received something less than adequate care, not because the nurses were bad or the doctors were indifferent, but because the system around them had been quietly stripped of what it needed to function, diverted into something else, managed by people for whom the patients were a revenue line. When can I talk to the investigators? She said. 2 o'clock, he said. I'll be ready. She walked back into the ER. Hollis was at the station. 3 new patients had come in while she'd been in the consultation room. She picked up the first chart, read the presenting complaint, and started moving toward the bay before anyone had to ask. At 11:47 a.m., a notification came over the hospital's internal communication system. An all-staff memo, which was unusual at this hour. It was brief. It announced that Gareth Slade had been placed on administrative leave effective immediately, pending an investigation by federal and state authorities. An interim administrator would be named by the end of the day. Hollis read it out loud to no one in particular. Tomas said, "Huh." The ER continued. Nora read the memo over Hollis's shoulder, turned back to the bay where her patient was waiting, and did not say anything at all. Because what Aldrich had told her this morning, the part she hadn't processed yet, the part that kept circling back no matter how many tasks she set between herself and it, was not about Slade. It was about the board members. 3 of them of significant interest, and one of them, according to Aldrich, had been using the hospital's administrative records to track complaint histories, to identify which staff members had been making noise, internally or externally, to flag them for removal before they became problems. She had filed 3 internal complaints in 14 months, 2 about resource allocation in the ER, one about a medication dispensing irregularity that she'd believed at the time was a procedural issue. She'd been fired yesterday for a patient complaint that hadn't been her fault. She'd been fired because someone had been watching the complaint records and had decided she was a flag that needed to be removed. They had not done their homework on her. That was the thing. They had looked at her the way Slade had always looked at her, as someone easy to dismiss, easy to erase, someone who would accept the decision and disappear. and they had not looked deeper than that surface reading, because people like that rarely did. They had dismissed her 14 months ago when she walked in the door, and they'd been dismissing her ever since, and none of them had thought for one moment about what might be underneath the quiet. She worked through the rest of her morning with that settled around her, not as anger, not as satisfaction, but as a kind of information. She knew what was coming at 2 o'clock. She knew what her records contained. She knew what the investigators would do with them. What she did not know yet, what she would find out in approximately 4 hours in a way she had not anticipated and had not prepared for, was that her documentation contained something beyond what she'd knowingly recorded. A date, a room number, a patient identifier she'd noted in passing 11 months ago without understanding what it meant. Something that connected a board member not just to financial fraud, but to a patient outcome that had not been an accident. She didn't know that yet, but the investigators who had been building this case for 2 years did. And at 2:03 p.m., when she sat down across from them and opened the folder she'd retrieved from her car, one of them would slide a photograph across the table and ask her if she recognized the date she'd written in the margin of her own notes. And she would. The photograph was a printout, slightly grainy, the kind pulled from a digital archive rather than an original scan. It showed a hospital room, a patient in a bed, a timestamp in the lower right corner, November 14th, 11 months ago. Nora looked at the date she'd written in her own handwriting in the margin of her notes. November 14th, room 309. Patient transferred to palliative without documented escalation pathway. Query re. Attending sign-off. She had written that in the margin because something had bothered her about the discharge note, and she hadn't been able to articulate exactly what. She'd flagged it internally, gotten no response, and moved on because she had 12 other patients and a charge nurse who made it clear that questions about administrative transfers were above her pay grade. She looked up from the photograph. The investigator across from her, a woman named Soto, federal badge, the kind of face that gave nothing away without working at it, was watching her carefully. "You wrote that note," Soto said. "I did." "Do you remember the patient?" "I remember the situation. The patient had a chart I questioned. The attending's signature on the palliative transfer order didn't match the signature style I'd seen on that physician's previous documentation. It was a small thing. I didn't know what to make of it." Soto slid a second page across the table. "The attending whose name appears on that transfer order was on vacation in Phoenix on November 14th. We have his credit card records, his hotel key card, and a photograph from a restaurant surveillance camera placing him in Scottsdale at 6 p.m. that evening." The room went very quiet. "Someone forged the order," Nora said. "Someone forged the order," Soto confirmed. The patient, 73 years old, cognate, no terminal diagnosis, was transferred to palliative care and died 11 days later. His family had been in a billing dispute with the hospital for 4 months over a prior stay. The dispute was resolved upon his death, with the estate settling for a fraction of what would have been owed. Nora set the photograph down. She did it carefully, because the alternative was to put her hands somewhere they weren't visible, which was not something she wanted to do right now. "There are 2 other cases," Soto said. "Similar patterns. Different physicians' names on the orders. All 3 patients were in active billing disputes. All 3 died within 30 days of transfer. The transfers all routed through the same administrative authorization code, a code that traces back to the board's Patient Outcome Oversight Committee." "Who chairs that committee?" Nora said, though she was already assembling the answer. Soto said a name. Nora had seen that name on the hospital's governance website. A man she had never met in person, had seen twice in the building from a distance. A board member who had been on Hartwell Regional's governance structure for 9 years. A man named Warren Pruitt. "He's not here?" she said. "He left Denton Falls this morning. We have a federal hold on his travel, but he moved faster than we anticipated." Soto's voice didn't change. "We have people at the Denver airport and 2 ground teams covering the mountain passes, but I want to be clear about something." She leaned forward slightly. The forged orders were executed through the hospital's internal medical records system. To forge a physician's documentation signature convincingly enough to pass an internal audit, you need access to that physician's previous records. The specific formatting patterns, the authentication tokens, the order entry history. Nora could see where it was going. Someone inside the clinical system did it, she said. Someone with high-level administrative access to the medical records infrastructure. Not physician-level access. Higher. Soto paused. The system logs show the access came from a workstation in the executive suite, but the access credentials used belonged to someone who should not have had that level of system permission, someone whose credentials were upgraded 14 months ago. 14 months ago. The same week Nora had arrived. She understood it then, the full shape of it, the way the pieces that had never quite fit now arranged themselves into something that made a terrible, coherent sense. She had been hired during a window when the administration had been reshuffling access permissions. Someone had used that reshuffling as cover. Her arrival had been noise in the system at exactly the right moment. "You're telling me my hire date is in the access logs," she said. "Your hire date coincides with the permission upgrade that shouldn't have happened. That's not an accusation. The credentials that were elevated weren't yours, but the reshuffling that masked it used the new hire processing workflow as a vehicle. Someone used the paperwork from my onboarding to hide a system access change. That's what the forensics suggest, yes." She sat with that. The sensation it produced was not quite anger. It was something more like recognition, the feeling of a pattern completing itself in a direction she hadn't seen coming. They had hired her and then used her presence, her paperwork, her existence in the system as a bureaucratic blind, and then they had spent 14 months making her life at this facility difficult enough that she would leave before she ever asked the right questions. And when she hadn't left, Slade had fired her. And the next morning, everything had come apart. "What do you need from me?" she said. "Your documentation, which you've already provided." Soto gathered the papers and aligned them. "And one more thing. Last night, when you treated Reeves, did he say anything to you before he lost consciousness?" She thought back. The bay. The echo machine. Tomas with the probe. She'd been working, narrating, focused entirely on the clinical sequence. But there had been a moment, just before she'd started the pericardiocentesis, when Reeves had surfaced briefly, the way patients sometimes did when their body registered a change in pain or pressure. He'd looked at her. His eyes had tried to focus. He'd said 4 words. She had filed them away and not thought about them since because she'd been in the middle of a procedure. She said them to Soto now. Soto went very still. "Say that again?" she said. Nora said it again. Soto stood up. She picked up her phone and stepped to the corner of the room, keeping her back partially turned, but Nora could see enough. The call connected fast, the words were brief, and Soto's posture changed with the specific quality of someone who has just moved an investigation from Phase 3 to Phase 4 without planning to do it today. She came back to the table. "Reeves was in this area because of Pruitt," she said. "Not the hospital in general, Pruitt specifically. Reeves had been tracking a money transfer that originated from Hartwell Regional's administrative accounts 3 months ago, a transfer to an account that connects to Pruitt's secondary financial interests. He was here to verify a physical location, a property that Pruitt has been using as part of the asset structure." She paused. "When Reeves was injured, he was within a mile of that property." "What's at the property?" Nora said. "We don't know yet. We have a team moving toward it now." Soto's phone buzzed. She looked at it. The expression that crossed her face was controlled, but not completely. "What?" Nora said. "The team at the property just made contact." Soto looked up. "There's a second person on site, someone who was not supposed to be there." She paused. "Someone who matches Warren Pruitt's description and who, when the agents identified themselves, did not comply with instructions." "He's there now?" "He was." Soto was already moving toward the door. "There's been a complication." She stopped in the doorway and turned back. "Don't go anywhere," she told Nora. "I mean that literally. We may need you in the next 30 minutes. "For what?" Soto hesitated. A half second, the kind of hesitation that belonged to someone deciding how much to say. "There's a 4th patient," she said, "in the access logs. A 4th forged order dated 6 weeks ago for a patient who is currently still alive, currently still in this building." She held Nora's gaze. "And if Pruitt was at that property and he's now in the wind, the patient's care team needs to know what to look for." The door swung shut behind her. Nora was already standing. She didn't wait for Soto to come back. She went to the nursing station and pulled up the patient census for the current inpatient population. Not the ER board, the full facility roster, every admitted patient floor by floor. And she started reading. She didn't know the fourth patient's name. She didn't know the floor, the room, the diagnosis. What she knew was that a forged palliative transfer order had been entered into the system 6 weeks ago for someone who was still alive, which meant the order had either not been executed or had been flagged before it could be, or it was waiting. She thought about that. Waiting for what? Waiting for a trigger, a second authorization, a specific condition, a person with access to the system to complete what had been started. The previous 3 cases had moved from forged order to transfer to death within 30 days. If this one had been entered 6 weeks ago and the patient was still here, something had interrupted the sequence. She needed to know who. Hollis was at the station, fielding a call. Nora leaned past her and typed her own credentials into the terminal. She still had them. Nobody had formally deactivated her access because the administrative machinery that handled terminations was the same machinery that was currently being occupied by federal investigators, and pulled up the audit trail for palliative transfer orders entered in the last 8 weeks. 3 came up. 2 were legitimate. She could see the physician's sign-offs, the escalation pathways, the family consultation notes, all the documentation that made a palliative transfer a clinical decision rather than an administrative one. The 3rd had no escalation pathway, no family consultation. The attending signature was there, but the order had been entered at 11:47 p.m. on a Wednesday 6 weeks ago, and the attending whose name was on it worked day shifts and had not been in the building after 5 p.m. that day, based on the badge swipe log visible in the system's sidebar. She looked at the patient identifier. Room 417. Dorothy Mabry, 78 years old, admitted for complications following a hip fracture repair. No terminal diagnosis, no DNR on file. Active physical therapy plan. She was 4 floors up and 2 rooms from Gerald. Nora was moving before she'd finished processing the thought. Yet, the elevator took too long. She took the stairs. Room 417 was at the far end of the 4th floor corridor, which meant she passed the nursing station without stopping and arrived at the door with enough momentum that she had to actively slow herself before she went in. She knocked twice, a habit, always knock, even in a crisis, and pushed the door open. Dorothy Mabry was awake. She was small in the hospital bed, the way elderly patients often were. Not frail exactly, but reduced by the specific indignity of inpatient care, the institutional gown, and the unfamiliar lighting, and the position that beds always settled you into. She had a physical therapy progress board on the wall, covered in handwritten notes in different colors. She had 3 get well cards on the windowsill and a photograph she'd propped against the water pitcher. She looked at Nora with the alert eyes of someone who had been awake for a while and was not sure what to make of an unfamiliar face. "Are you my new nurse?" she said. Her voice was clearer than Nora expected. "I'm checking in on you," Nora said. She moved to the bedside and glanced at the monitor. Heart rate, oxygen saturation, everything reading normal. She checked the IV line, the pump settings, the drip rate. "How are you feeling?" "Bored," Dorothy said. "My knee aches. They say I'm ahead of schedule on the therapy, but it doesn't feel like it." She paused. "You look like you've had a very bad couple of days." "I'm fine," Nora said. "You don't look fine. You look like someone who's been running since yesterday and hasn't eaten." Nora looked up from the pump settings. Dorothy was watching her with the particular attention of someone who'd spent enough decades watching people to know what they actually looked like underneath what they were presenting. "Your orders," Nora said carefully. "Has anyone spoken to you about a change in your care plan in the last few days or weeks?" Dorothy's expression shifted. "No. Should they have?" "No," Nora said. "I'm just confirming." She pulled up the chart on the room terminal. The palliative transfer order was there in the system. She could see it in the pending orders queue, tagged as requiring a second administrative authorization before it could be executed. The second authorization had never come. The order had been sitting in the queue for 6 weeks, inactive, waiting for whoever was supposed to complete it. She flagged it for immediate review and attached a note. Not clinical language, not administrative language, just plain text. "This order is under active federal investigation. Do not execute." Contact Dr. Morales or Dr. Cruz before any changes to this patient's care plan. Then she added her name. Mrs. Mabry, she said, I need you to do something for me. What's that? If anyone comes into this room and suggests changing your care plan, moving you to a different floor, adjusting your treatment goals, anything that doesn't come from your regular care team, I need you to tell them you want to speak with your family first, and then I need you to push your call button immediately. Dorothy looked at her for a long moment. Is something wrong with me that nobody's told me about? She said. Her voice didn't waver, but the question was direct in the way that elderly people's serious questions often were, stripped of the softening that younger people used. No, Nora said, there is nothing wrong with you clinically. What I'm telling you is precautionary. She met the woman's eyes. You are going to be fine, but I need you to be careful for the next few hours. All right, Dorothy said. She seemed to make a decision and stick to it immediately, which Nora found deeply reassuring. I can do that. Thank you. She left the room and pulled out her phone to call Soto. Soto picked up on the second ring. The fourth patient is Dorothy Mabry, room 417, Nora said. The order's in the pending queue. It needs a second administrative authorization to execute. That authorization hasn't come through. I've flagged the order. Someone needs to formally place a hold on it through the hospital's legal channel and have it removed from the queue entirely. We're already on it, Soto said. I got your flag 2 minutes ago. The system alerts go to the investigation team's monitoring feed. A pause. Are you with her now? I just left her room. She's stable. She's alert. Good. Stay in the building. Another pause, shorter. We found Pruitt. Where? He was at the property when the team arrived. He attempted to leave through a rear access. He's in federal custody as of 20 minutes ago. We're transporting him. Soto's voice stayed level, but there was something underneath it. The particular quality of a person who has been working toward a specific moment for a long time and has just arrived at it. He had a laptop, external drives. We don't know yet what's on them, but based on what he tried to destroy before the team made entry, he tried to destroy them? He got through one drive. The other two are intact. She paused. We think they contain the full record. Patient files, financial transfers, the system access logs that show how the credential elevation was done. Everything we've been building toward circumstantially, we may have it directly. Nora was in the corridor outside 417, one hand on the wall, the other holding the phone. What about Slade? She said. He's been cooperative, which is its own form of information. Soto let that settle. When people who've been running something like this become cooperative immediately, it usually means they've already decided who they're going to hand over. He's going to give you Pruitt. He's going to try to give us Pruitt in exchange for a reduced exposure. Whether that works for him is a question for prosecutors. A brief pause. The board members. We've made contact with 2 of them. The third is currently unreachable. We're working on it. Who's the third? Soto said, a name Nora didn't recognize. Then she said, she also sits on the board of 2 other regional hospital systems in Colorado. The implication moved through Nora slowly, and then all at once, the way cold water does when you step into it. This isn't just Hartwell Regional, she said. We don't know yet how far it goes. That's a question for a longer investigation. Soto's voice was careful. What I can tell you is that the pattern we've identified here, the billing structure, the patient targeting, the method, it's sophisticated. It didn't develop fully formed in one facility. Nora stood in the corridor for a moment, not moving. I'll stay in the building, she said. She ended the call. She went back down to the ER, not because anyone needed her specifically, but because the ER was where she understood the work. And right now the work was the only thing keeping the shape of the day from collapsing into something unmanageable. Hollis had it well in hand. 3 patients, nothing critical. The specific mid-morning calm of a department that had burned white-hot the night before and was now in recovery. Tomas was restocking a supply cart. He looked up when she came in. You okay? He said. Working on it. She picked up a chart. How's Bay 2? Chest pain, almost certainly musculoskeletal. Cruz is with him. She nodded and set the chart down. She didn't have a role here right now. No standing, no authorization, no clinical assignment. She had a federal investigation she was peripherally embedded in and a documentation file that was currently in the possession of 2 federal agents and a woman 4 floors up who was safe for now. She sat down in the chair at the end of the nursing station that nobody used because it was too close to the supply cabinet to be comfortable, and she let herself be still for approximately 3 minutes. Her phone buzzed. It was a number she didn't recognize. She almost let it go, then answered. "Is this Nora Voss?" A man's voice. Older, slightly roughened, careful with the consonants. "Who is this?" "My name is Leonard Mabry. I'm Dorothy Mabry's son. I got a call from the hospital, from someone in administration, saying my mother's care team had recommended a transition to comfort care and I needed to come in and sign some paperwork." Nora's spine went rigid. "When did you receive this call?" she said. "About 40 minutes ago. I'm already on my way. I'm 20 minutes out." His voice had the controlled quality of a man who was frightened but hadn't let it become panic yet. "The woman who called said it wasn't an emergency, but she strongly recommended I come in as soon as possible. She said my mother had declined overnight." "Mr. Mabry, your mother has not declined. I was in her room 20 minutes ago. She is alert, stable, and ahead of schedule on her physical therapy." Nora was already moving toward the elevator. "Do not sign anything when you arrive. Do not let anyone change her care plan without Dr. Cruz or Dr. Morales present. I'm going back to her room now." A pause. "What's happening?" he said. "I'll explain when you get here. 20 minutes. Come directly to room 417. Don't stop at the front desk." She ended the call and hit the elevator button. The call to Dorothy's son hadn't come from Nora's flag. Her flag had been entered 25 minutes ago. The call to Leonard Mabry had gone out 40 minutes ago, 15 minutes before Nora had found the order in the system. Someone had known the investigation was moving. Someone had tried to accelerate the 4th case before it could be stopped. The elevator was too slow. She took the stairs again. Room 417 was the same as she'd left it. Dorothy was in the same position, the same alert posture, the get well card still on the windowsill. But there was a woman in the room now, standing near the foot of the bed, a tablet in her hand, wearing the lanyard of someone in a patient services function. Nora didn't know her name. She knew her face, had seen her twice in administrative corridors, once at a meeting she'd passed in the hallway on her way somewhere else. The woman turned when Nora came in. "Can I help you?" She had the professional tone of someone whose job required her to sound pleasant at all times, regardless of how unpleasant the situation was. "What are you doing in this room?" Nora said. "I'm conducting a patient services check-in." She glanced at Dorothy. "I was just explaining to Mrs. Mabry that her care team has not recommended anything. The order you're referring to is flagged under a federal investigation and has been since 25 minutes ago." Nora stepped fully into the room. She kept her voice level, not because she wasn't angry, but because level voices in rooms with patients were better for everyone, including the patient. "I need you to leave this room." The woman's composure cracked slightly. Not fully. She'd been trained against that. But enough. "I'm not sure you have the authority." "I have enough," Nora said. "And you're going to want to be somewhere else in the next 5 minutes, because federal investigators are currently in this building, and the order you've been sent here to facilitate is the specific thing they're looking for." She held the woman's gaze. "Go." The tablet came down. The woman walked out. Dorothy watched the door close. "Well," she said, "that was something. I'm sorry you had to see that." "Don't apologize." Dorothy straightened slightly in the bed. "She came in here talking about comfort care in that voice they use, like they're sorry for something they haven't done yet. I didn't like it." She paused. "I pushed the call button when she walked in, by the way, like you told me." Nora looked at the call panel. The light was on. She hadn't noticed it when she'd come in. She'd been too focused on the woman at the foot of the bed. "Good," she said. That was exactly right. She stepped into the corridor and called Soto. Soto answered in 2 rings. "Someone tried to execute the 4th case," Nora said. "Patient services contact in the room right now. She left when I confronted her, but you need her on camera before she leaves the building." A pause, brief, operative. Description. She gave it, approximate age, height, the lanyard color, what she'd been wearing. "On it," Soto said. Are you with the patient? In her corridor. Her son is 20 minutes out. Stay with her until we can post someone. I know. She went back into 417 and sat in the chair beside Dorothy's bed and did not perform calm, just maintained it, which was a different thing and considerably harder. Her back hurt from the stairs. She was 34 years old and had slept 4 hours and had eaten nothing since a vending machine granola bar at some point during the previous afternoon. Her hands were steady. Dorothy was watching her. You're not just a nurse, are you? She said. It wasn't a question. I am a nurse, Nora said. I'm also other things. What other things? Someone who doesn't like it when people get hurt for someone else's convenience. Dorothy seemed to consider this. My late husband used to say there were two kinds of people who went into helping professions. The ones who needed to feel useful and the ones who couldn't stand it when things were wrong. She studied Nora. I think you're the second kind. Nora didn't answer. That's not a criticism, Dorothy added. Leonard Mabry arrived in 18 minutes, which meant he'd driven faster than he'd said. He was in his mid-50s, the kind of man who'd spent his adult life building a deliberate calm and was currently losing it at the edges. He came through the room door and went straight to his mother, and they had a brief, quiet exchange that Nora didn't listen to. When he turned to her, his eyes were asking about 15 things at once. She walked him into the corridor and told him as much as she could without crossing the line into what was federal information. The forged order, the flag, the woman who'd come to the room, the fact that his mother was safe, had been safe, and was going to remain safe. Who did this? He said. That's for investigators to establish formally. She paused. But the people responsible are no longer in a position to affect your mother's care. He looked at her for a long moment. The call I got? The woman who said my mother had declined overnight. Your mother hasn't declined. She's ahead of schedule. He ran a hand across his face. It was a gesture of relief and exhaustion, and something that hadn't resolved itself yet. Why would anyone... Mr. Mabry. She said it gently, but directly. I can't answer all of those questions right now. What I can tell you is that your mother needs you in that room more than she needs an explanation at this particular moment. The explanation will come. He nodded. He went back inside. Nora stayed in the corridor. At 1:17 p.m., Soto texted her. Patient services contact identified and detained. Hospital security footage confirms she received a call at 10:02 a.m. from an internal extension registered to the administrative suite. Cross-referencing now. At 1:34 p.m., a second text. The extension traces to a secondary workstation in Slade's office. Used this morning at 10:01 a.m. Slade was in federal custody by 9:15 a.m. Nora read that twice. If Slade was in federal custody by 9:15, he hadn't made that call, which meant someone else had been in his office. Someone with access to his office, access to his workstation, access to the same administrative credential structure that had been elevated 14 months ago when Nora arrived. She called Soto. Someone was in Slade's office after he was taken in, she said. Someone who knew his workstation. You said the third board member is unreachable. We've been tracking that, Soto said. Her voice had shifted. The operational flatness was still there, but underneath it something had compressed. Her name is Valerie Korst. She's been on the board for 6 years. We had an address and 2 phone numbers, neither of which have been answered. What does she look like? Soto described her. Nora's memory cross-referenced it against every face she'd seen in this building in the past 24 hours. Most of them she knew. Staff, patients, investigators, the military personnel, the 2 suits from this morning, and then the family consultation room. Last night, 10:30 p.m., when she'd come back from her conversation with Aldrich. She'd passed a woman in the corridor outside, small, 50s, unremarkable coat, moving with the unhurried pace of someone who knew exactly where they were going. She'd logged the face automatically and then released it because there'd been more urgent things. A board member who had been in this building last night, who had known about Reeves, about the investigation moving, about the timeline compressing, who had come in, not today, not when investigators were swarming the administrative corridor, but last night, in the hours before anyone knew exactly how much had been exposed. Soto, Nora said slowly. Is it possible Korst was in this building last night? After hours? A pause. We're pulling the security footage now. She may have accessed the system last night, set something up. The call that went to Leonard Mabry this morning could have been automated, queued last night to send this morning, routed through Slade's workstation to create cover. She could hear the sound of rapid typing on the other end. If she was here last night, Soto said, she may still have been here this morning, before we arrived. And if she left, she'd know this building. She's been on the board for 6 years. She'd know the exits. Another pause. She'd know the service routes. Nora looked down the corridor in both directions. The 4th floor was quiet, routine quiet, the midday stillness of a hospital floor that wasn't in crisis. Supply cart at the far end, elevator bank to the left, stairwell door to the right, the same one she'd taken twice today. The stairwell door had a small square of wire-reinforced glass in it. She looked at it because she was standing in the corridor, and there was nothing else to look at. And then she looked at it again, more carefully, because the shadow on the other side of the glass was not the empty landing she'd passed through twice this morning. It was a person, standing very still, on the other side of the door, watching. She didn't move toward the door. That was the first decision, and it was the right one. Moving toward the door meant the person on the other side would see her coming, would have time to react, would disappear into a stairwell that had 4 floors of exits and a basement she'd never been in. She stayed exactly where she was and kept her eyes slightly off-center from the glass, the way she'd been trained to look at something without looking at it, and she spoke into the phone. "Soto," she said at normal volume, in the tone of someone continuing a conversation. "I need you to send someone to the 4th floor stairwell, north side, right now. Don't announce it over the radio." "What do you have?" "A person in the stairwell who's been standing still for the last 45 seconds, watching the corridor through the door glass. Could be nothing. I don't think it's nothing." She heard Soto move. Not running. She was somewhere that running would draw attention, but the quick, purposeful movement of someone redirecting. 2 minutes, Soto said. 2 minutes was a long time. She knew that. She kept her position, kept her body language neutral, kept talking into the phone, as though the call was continuing normally. She said a series of completely unremarkable things about Dorothy Mabry's care plan and Leonard's arrival time and the flagged order, real information delivered in a tone designed to communicate to anyone watching that she was unaware of being watched. The shadow behind the glass didn't move. That was what told her it was deliberate. A person who'd stepped into a stairwell to check their phone or rest their feet for a moment would have moved by now. Shifted weight, checked the time, started climbing or descending. This person had been standing in the same position for close to a minute, which was not an accidental pause. This was surveillance. This was someone monitoring the corridor to determine whether it was safe. Safe to do what? Nora didn't know yet. At 90 seconds, the stairwell door at the far end of the corridor, the south side opposite from where she was standing, opened quietly. A man in a federal jacket came through it, and behind him a second agent, and they moved down the corridor with their eyes on her. She gave them the smallest possible gesture with her chin, that direction, that door, and stepped back against the wall. The first agent reached the north stairwell door and pushed through it in one motion. What happened in the next 8 seconds she heard rather than saw. The sound of the door swinging hard, a sharp command, a woman's voice saying something that was not compliance, the thud of someone's back against a wall, and then the specific silence of a physical situation that has resolved. She went to the door. Valerie Korst was 57, which was older than Nora had estimated from the corridor glimpse the night before. In person, close up, she had the look of someone who had spent a long career being the most capable person in a room and had arranged the room accordingly for decades. She was pressed against the stairwell wall with one agent holding her arm and another standing 2 steps up, and her face had the particular expression of a person whose plan has not worked and who is now rapidly calculating what leverage they have left. Not much. Nora could see her reaching for it and coming back empty. "Ms. Korst," the first agent said, "we need you to come with us." "I want to call my attorney," she said. Her voice was controlled. It was the most controlled thing about her right now. "You'll have that opportunity." She looked past the agent at Nora standing in the stairwell doorway. It was a brief look, a few seconds. and there was nothing in it that was afraid. There was calculation. There was something Nora recognized as the assessment of a person who was trying to determine how much Nora knew and whether any of it could be managed. Nora gave her nothing to read. "You've been in this building since last night," Nora said. Not a question. Course said nothing. The automated call to Leonard Mabry, the patient services contact in room 417. You set both of those up before the investigators arrived this morning because you knew they were coming and you wanted the fourth case closed before anyone could stop it. She paused. You hid in this building and waited to see if it worked. Still nothing. But Course's jaw moved slightly, the way people's jaws move when they are physically preventing themselves from responding. It didn't work, Nora said. The agents walked her out of the stairwell and down the corridor, and Nora stepped back to give them room. And that was the last she saw of Valerie Course's face. Turned slightly, looking back at the north stairwell door as if she were memorizing it, the way people look at things they don't expect to see again. Nora stood in the empty corridor for a moment. Her phone buzzed. Soto. Good call. We have her. Stand by. Went back to Dorothy Mabry's room. Leonard was sitting in the chair beside his mother's bed when she came in, and they were talking about something unrelated to any of this. She caught the tail end of it, something about a dog, a neighbor, a fence repair that had been pending for months. It was the conversation of two people who'd been frightened and had found their way back to something ordinary, and Nora stood in the doorway for a moment without interrupting it. Dorothy saw her. She's staying, Dorothy told her son, with the absolute certainty of someone who had decided something. Leonard looked at Nora. Is it over? The immediate situation is over, she said. The larger process will take time, but no one is going to touch her care plan. He exhaled, a long, unsteady exhale that he'd clearly been holding since the phone call that morning. Who were these people? Why would anyone— Leonard, Dorothy put a hand on his arm. Let the woman breathe. He stopped. Nora came into the room and sat in the second chair, the one by the window, and for a few minutes she just sat there. Dorothy and Leonard resumed their conversation about the dog and the fence, including her peripherally the way comfortable people include a stranger, not demanding engagement, just keeping the door open. The afternoon light through the window was the pale gold of late October, the specific color of Colorado in fall that she'd noticed on her first week in Denton Falls, and that still occasionally surprised her. She was still sitting there when Soto appeared in the doorway. They went back to the consultation room, the same one where they'd met at 2 p.m. the day before, though it felt like considerably more time had passed. Soto sat across from her and set a tablet on the table between them. Course is in federal custody, she said. Slade has been formally charged. Wire fraud, healthcare fraud, conspiracy to commit the same. His cooperation agreement is being reviewed by prosecutors, which means he's already told them everything he knows about Pruitt and Korst in exchange for whatever he thinks he's getting. She paused. Pruitt has been charged with 3 counts of conspiracy to commit murder in the second degree, in addition to the financial fraud charges. The forged orders, the 3 deaths. The DA is treating each case as a separate count. Nora absorbed that. And Korst? Same charges as Pruitt on the criminal side. She's also facing 2 additional charges related to the attempt on Dorothy Mabry. The automated call and the patient services contact will both be charged as overt acts in furtherance of the conspiracy. Soto picked up the tablet, set it back down. The 2 other hospital systems she sat on the boards of are under review. We're not there yet. That's a longer road. How many patients? Nora said. Soto looked at her. We know of 3 confirmed deaths. We're reviewing a broader set of cases, patients who were in billing disputes and whose outcomes were anomalous in some way. We don't have a final number. But more than 3. Almost certainly more than 3. Nora put her hands flat on the table. It was a thing she did when she needed to feel the surface of something solid. She'd noticed it about herself years ago and had never fully stopped doing it. The documentation I gave you, she said, the records I kept, they corroborated the system logs in 11 specific instances. Your notes, combined with the IT forensics, give us a complete evidentiary chain on the credential elevation and on the 3 confirmed cases. Your documentation is probably the reason this prosecution moves cleanly. Soto paused. I want to be direct with you about that. What you recorded, not because you knew what you were recording, but because you're the kind of person who keeps records of things that don't add up. That's what closes this. Nora didn't say anything. You want to know something else? Soto said. She looked up. The complaint that got you fired. The patient who had the pain management issue after the call light malfunctioned. We pulled the complaint file. She opened something on the tablet and turned it toward Nora. The complaint wasn't filed by the family. The family never complained. The complaint was fabricated, entered into the system using a patient services template, attributed to a family member who, when we contacted her this morning, said she had no idea what we were talking about, and that the nursing care her father received was excellent. Nora looked at the document on the tablet for a moment. Slade fabricated the complaint to fire me, she said. We believe so. The entry timestamp shows it was created at 6:43 a.m. on the morning of the day he fired you, using an administrative credential assigned to a patient services staffer who had no record of filing it. Soto closed the tablet. You were going to be removed regardless of what you did or didn't do clinically. The complaint was the mechanism. You'd been flagged as a risk, someone asking questions, someone with documentation habits that made administration nervous, and they needed a pretext. Nora thought about the morning of the previous day. 6:47 a.m. She'd arrived 13 minutes early. She'd gone to Gerald's room first. She'd caught the medication discrepancy on the post-cardiac patient. She'd done exactly what she always did. And at 6:43 that morning, someone had been typing the complaint that would be used to walk her out of the building 8 hours later. She felt the full weight of that, not as anger, though the anger was there underneath it, clean and legitimate. What she felt more precisely was the particular exhaustion of having been right about something for a long time and having had no way to prove it, and then having it confirmed all at once in a room that was very quiet. What happens to my license? She said. Nothing. The termination will be formally reversed. The hospital's interim administration is already processing it. You'll receive written documentation that your dismissal was without cause and without clinical grounds. Soto leaned back slightly. You can sue the hospital. I'll be honest, your employment attorney would probably have a reasonable case. I'm not interested in a lawsuit. I know. I didn't think you would be. She paused. There's something else I was asked to convey, directly from Colonel Aldrich. Nora waited. Reeves is awake, Soto said. He's been told who performed the decompression that kept him alive long enough to reach the OR. He asked us to pass along that he's grateful, which he said was inadequate, but was what he had. She paused. Aldrich's message is less polished. He said, and I'm quoting, tell her we could use someone like her in about 30 different places, and whenever she figures out what she wants, she should call. Nora looked at the table for a moment. Tell him I'll think about it, she said. Soto nodded. That's what he expected you to say. She left the consultation room at 4:15 in the afternoon and walked back through the hospital with the specific clarity of a person who has been moving fast for 36 hours and has finally stopped. The building felt different around her, not because anything physical had changed, but because the context had, and context was what made a space feel like one thing or another. 2 days ago, this building had been the place where she was perpetually provisional, always slightly under review, always one wrong step from a consequence she hadn't earned. Now the administrative corridor was occupied by federal investigators and an interim director nobody had heard of, and Gareth Slade's parking spot was empty, and the board of directors of Hartwell Regional Medical Center had gone from 7 members to 4 in the span of a single afternoon. She stopped at the nursing station on the 4th floor. Hollis was there, end of her shift, transferring notes with the efficient irritability of someone who'd had a more complicated day than expected and was ready to be somewhere else. She looked up when Nora arrived. How's 417? Nora asked. Stable, ate dinner. Physical therapy came by and she did the full session. Hollis paused. Her son is still there. Good. Hollis looked at her for a moment, the direct, measuring look of a person deciding whether to say something. I heard what happened. With Slade. With all of it. She paused. I've been a nurse for 19 years. I've worked under 3 directors here. I should have said something about Slade a long time ago. You had reasons not to. I had fear. That's not quite the same thing. She held Nora's gaze. I'm sorry you were the one who had to carry it. Nora didn't deflect it or minimize it. She let it land as what it was. An honest thing, said plainly, by someone who was uncomfortable saying it and said it anyway. Thank you, she said. She went to room 4171 one last time. Dorothy was awake, dinner tray pushed to one side. Leonard had fallen asleep in the chair by the window, his coat still on, head tipped back, breathing with the deep unconsciousness of someone who'd burned through adrenaline and had nothing left. Dorothy looked at him and then at Nora with the quiet amusement of someone who's watched the people they love be tired for decades. He drove here at 80 miles an hour, she said softly. I know because he always grips the wheel with both hands when he goes fast, and his knuckles were white when he came in. He was scared for you. I know. She looked at her son. He's a good boy. He worries too much. He had reason to today. Yes, Dorothy said. He did. She looked back at Nora. Is it actually over? You can tell me. I'm 78. I can handle the truth. It's over for you, Nora said. The people who put that order in your chart are in federal custody. Your care plan will continue as written. You'll finish your physical therapy and go home and argue with your neighbor about the fence. Dorothy almost smiled. The fence has been a problem for 6 years. Then you'll argue about it for at least 6 more. She did smile then. A real one, slow and specific, the kind that belonged to her actual face and not to any performance of being fine. You should sleep, Dorothy told her. You look like you need it more than I do. I'll sleep tonight, Nora said. She said goodnight and left the room and walked down the corridor toward the elevator. And this time she waited for it instead of taking the stairs. The weeks that followed were not clean. She'd known they wouldn't be. Nothing that had been built over years got dismantled in days. And the investigation that had entered Hartwell Regional like a controlled detonation was going to take months to fully process. There were depositions, documentation reviews, follow-up interviews with Soto's team that pulled her in on short notice and ran long. There were days when the bureaucratic machinery of consequence moved with excruciating slowness, and days when it moved with an efficiency that felt almost impersonal, like watching water find a drain. Gareth Slade pleaded guilty to federal wire fraud and healthcare fraud charges 6 weeks after his arrest. His cooperation agreement reduced his exposure, but not to nothing. He received a sentence of 4 years in federal prison, forfeited his assets related to the scheme, and surrendered his healthcare administration credentials permanently. The surrender of the credentials was the part that mattered most to the people who'd worked under him. A man like Slade without a credential was a man without a lever. Warren Pruitt did not cooperate. He hired 3 attorneys and contested everything, which was his right and which the evidence made ultimately futile. The prosecution presented the intact drives recovered from the property outside Denton Falls. They presented the system access logs. They presented the forged transfer orders with forensic analysis showing the specific method of signature replication, a method that required both administrative access and specific knowledge of each physician's documentation pattern, the kind of knowledge that only came from sustained access to their clinical records. They presented the financial trail, the billing disputes that preceded each death, the resolution of those disputes following each death, the transfers to accounts connected to Pruitt's secondary financial network. The families of the 3 patients who had died testified. Nora sat in the gallery for one of those testimonies. She hadn't planned to attend the trial at all, but Soto had called and said she thought Nora should be there for at least one session, and she'd been right. The daughter of the first patient, a woman in her 40s who'd driven from Denver and sat very straight in the witness chair, described calling the hospital when her father was transferred to palliative care without her knowledge, being told it had been recommended by his care team, accepting that because she'd trusted the institution, and watching her father die 11 days later, still believing it had been a medical decision. She said, I thought the hospital was taking care of him. I thought that was what hospitals were for. Pruitt received consecutive sentences on 3 counts of second-degree murder conspiracy, in addition to the fraud charges. The total was 42 years. He was 61. The math was its own verdict. Valerie Korst pleaded no contest to the conspiracy charges and received 23 years, reduced from the original charge sheet in exchange for cooperation with the investigation into the 2 other hospital systems. That investigation was still ongoing. It was going to be ongoing for a while. The shape of what she and Pruitt had built was larger than Denton Falls, more distributed, older. It had been running, in various forms, for 11 years. The two other board members who'd been charged, men whose names had been in the investigation file but whom Nora had never seen in person, were processed separately, their cases moving through the system on their own tracks. One cooperated early. One did not. Both were convicted. The hospital's interim director was a woman named Paula Ferris, who had been brought in from a health system in Fort Collins and who arrived at Hartwell Regional with a forensic financial team, a staffing review, and the particular brand of quiet competence that follows disasters and precedes reconstruction. She met with Nora in her second week and asked direct questions and listened to the answers without flinching, which was itself notable after Slade. At that meeting, Ferris offered Nora her position back. Not the med-surg role, not the lateral move into ER that Slade had blocked. Something that didn't have a formal title yet, which Ferris acknowledged straight out. I need someone who can look at how emergency and trauma care works in this building and tell me what's wrong with it and how to make it not wrong. That's not a job posting. That's a problem I have, and you're the person I trust to help me solve it. Nora thought about it for 2 days. She called Aldrich, not to take him up on anything, but to talk through the question with someone who understood both sides of it, the clinical and the other kind of work she'd done before. He listened and then said, "You know what you want. You're just checking whether I'm going to argue with you." "Are you?" "No," he said, "but the offer stands. Whenever." "I know," she said. "Thank you." She called Ferris and accepted. It was Becca who told her about the letter. Not a formal notification. It came through the hospital's internal mail, addressed to Nora Voss with a state seal on the envelope. Inside was a letter from the Colorado Department of Health notifying her that based on the federal investigation's findings, her documentation and actions during the mass casualty event of October 21st had been reviewed by the state's Emergency Medical Services Advisory Board. The letter used careful bureaucratic language to say something that was not inherently bureaucratic, that her clinical judgment during the event had been exemplary, that her response to the cardiac tamponade had been specifically noted by the operating surgeons as directly responsible for the patient's survival, and that her personal documentation records had materially contributed to the prosecution of a healthcare fraud scheme of significant public harm. The last paragraph offered a commendation. It was signed by the state's chief medical officer. Becca had been the one to bring the letter to her because it had been delivered to the ER by mistake, and she'd read the return address and figured Nora should have it sooner rather than sitting in an administrative inbox somewhere. She stood in the doorway of the small office Nora had been using while her permanent workspace was being set up, and she said, "It's good, the letter. You should read it." Nora read it. She sat with it for a moment the way she sat with things that mattered. Not performing reaction, just feeling it actually land. "Thank you," she said. Becca lingered. "Are you actually staying? Ferris's role?" "Yes." "Good." She said it like it resolved something. "Because this place needs people who give a damn and also know what they're doing. Those are usually separate categories." "Sometimes they overlap," Nora said. "Yeah, well," Becca looked at the letter in Nora's hand. "Still, good." She left. Basievo. Dorothy Mabry was discharged on a Thursday, 6 weeks after the arrests, 4 weeks after completing her physical therapy. Nora happened to be near the main lobby when it happened. Not by design, she'd been on her way to a meeting with Ferris, and she saw Leonard pushing the wheelchair and Dorothy sitting in it with the focused dignity of a woman who had been in a hospital bed for too long and was very ready to be somewhere else. Dorothy saw her across the lobby. She didn't call out. She just raised a hand, a small, deliberate wave, the kind that meant something specific. And Nora raised one back. Leonard wheeled her toward the exit, and the doors slid open and they went through, and that was that. Nora continued to her meeting. Reeves was the last one. She hadn't expected to hear from him directly, but 2 months after the event, a letter arrived at the hospital, handwritten, which was rare enough in any context to be slightly startling. He had decent handwriting, small and precise. He said, He understood she might not want acknowledgement, and if that was the case, he apologized for writing. He said he'd been in that bay, aware enough to know that the situation was not going well, aware enough to understand that the person working on him was not performing for an audience or following a protocol. She was solving a problem that was going to kill him if it didn't get solved, and she'd solved it. He said he'd been in enough situations over the years to know the difference between competent and exceptional, and he wanted her to know he knew the difference. He didn't say what he did or where he worked or what the situation that had brought him to Denton Falls had actually been. He signed it with his last name only. She wrote back, shorter than his letter because she wasn't someone who expanded unnecessarily, but genuine in the way that she tried to be genuine about things that deserved it. She said she was glad he'd made it. She said she hoped the work he was doing, whatever it was worth the risk it clearly carried. She said, "Take care of yourself the way you take care of other things. That's usually the last priority for people like us, and it shouldn't be." She wasn't sure where that last part came from. She sent it anyway. She thought later about what the whole thing had meant, not in abstract terms, not as a lesson with a moral attached, but in the specific, unglamorous terms of what had actually happened and what it had cost and what it had changed. What had happened was that a young woman had come to a small-town hospital in Colorado carrying 14 years of experience that nobody in that building had been curious enough to discover, and had spent 14 months being systematically minimized by people who'd decided before they met her what she was worth, and had never revised the estimate. What had happened was that she'd kept working anyway, kept documenting anyway, kept giving a damn about patients who were being failed by a system that had been quietly hollowed out for profit, because the alternative was to stop giving a damn, and she didn't know how to do that. And what had happened, eventually, was that the thing they'd all bet on, her invisibility, her disposability, the fundamental assumption that she would accept being dismissed and disappear, had turned out to be exactly wrong. Not because she was exceptional in any cinematic sense, because she was thorough, because she kept records of things that didn't add up, because she'd gone to room 412 before she started her assessments on a morning when she should have been behind, because she'd stayed when leaving would have been easier and paid attention, and refused to become the person they needed her to be in order for the lie to keep running. The lie had run anyway, for a while. 3 people had died who shouldn't have died. That was the cost, and she carried it, and she didn't think she was going to stop carrying it because it was the kind of weight that was supposed to be felt. Feeling it was not the same as being crushed by it. She'd learned that distinction a long time ago, in conditions that had nothing to do with Colorado. What she'd learned more recently, what the past 2 months had clarified in a way she hadn't expected, was that the work itself was the thing. Not the recognition, not the vindication, not the letter with the state seal. The work was what mattered, done correctly, for the right reasons, for the people in the rooms who had no one else and needed someone who knew what they were doing. She'd known that before. She knew it more completely now. On a Tuesday in December, early enough that the mountain light was still coming in low and cold through the east-facing windows, Nora walked into Hartwell Regional and took the elevator to the 4th floor and stood in the corridor where she'd spent the longest day of her adult life and looked at the north stairwell door with its wire-reinforced glass. The corridor was empty. The wing was quiet. She had a meeting in 40 minutes with Ferris and the incoming trauma coordinator, a review of the new emergency triage protocols she'd spent the last 3 weeks rebuilding from the structural gaps up. She had, on her desk, a draft proposal for a patient advocacy review process, something she'd been designing slowly, carefully, with the kind of attention that the original structure had never received. She had Dorothy Mabry's follow-up appointment note filed in her personal calendar, not because she was Dorothy's nurse, but because she'd asked Leonard to let her know how the fence dispute resolved. He'd emailed last week. The neighbor had agreed to split the cost. Dorothy was insufferably pleased about it. She stood in the corridor for a moment longer. Then she turned and walked toward the elevator and hit the button for the ground floor. And when the doors opened, she stepped in and the doors closed behind her, and the building continued around her. The sounds and rhythms of a place that had been broken in one specific way and was in the specific unglamorous process of being repaired. She had helped break it open. She would help rebuild it. That was enough. It was more than enough. It was what she'd come here to do, even when she hadn't known it, even when the people running this place had worked methodically to make her feel like she had nothing to offer and no reason to stay. She had stayed anyway, and everything they'd built on the assumption that she wouldn't, every lie, every forged signature, every convenient transfer, every fabricated complaint, every decision made in the certainty that quiet people could be erased without consequence, had come apart. Not because she'd set out to destroy it, because she'd simply refused to disappear. The elevator opened onto the lobby. She walked through it, past Roy at the security desk, who raised 2 fingers in a wave without looking up from his newspaper, past the reception desk where someone was learning to say a difficult last name correctly on the 3rd try, past the row of chairs where a man was holding his knee and a woman was filling out paperwork and a child was asleep across 2 seats with her head in her mother's lap. She pushed through the door to the administrative wing and went to work.